scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa woke up in her bedroom. But something felt different. The sunlight streaming through her window seemed dimmer than usual, casting strange shadows across her pink walls. As she got dressed, Peppa noticed her reflection in the mirror was moving just a fraction of a second too late, as if it was trying to catch up with her movements. Downstairs in the kitchen, Mummy Pig was making breakfast, but her usual cheerful humming had been replaced by an eerie silence. When Peppa looked closely, she saw that Mummy Pig's eyes had turned completely black, like two dark holes in her face. Yet Mummy Pig continued cooking as if nothing had changed, her movements mechanical and precise. George was sitting at the breakfast table, but he wasn't playing with his toy dinosaur as usual. Instead, he was staring directly at Peppa with an unsettling grin that stretched far too wide across his face. His teeth, normally small and harmless, had become sharp and pointed like tiny daggers. The family car ride to playgroup felt endless. Daddy Pig drove in complete silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Through the car windows, Peppa could see that all the other houses in their neighborhood had their curtains drawn shut, and no other cars were on the road. When they arrived at the playgroup, the building looked exactly the same from the outside, but something was terribly wrong. The playground was empty, and the swings moved back and forth in the windless air as if invisible children were playing on them. The slide that was usually bright yellow had faded to a sickly pale color. Inside the classroom, all of Peppa's friends were already seated in a perfect circle. Susie Sheep, Rebecca Rabbit, Pedro Pony, and all the others sat motionless with their backs straight and their hands folded neatly in their laps. Their eyes had the same black emptiness that Peppa had seen in Mummy Pig's face. Madame Gazelle stood at the front of the classroom, but her usual warm smile had been replaced by something cold and calculating. When she spoke, her voice echoed strangely, as if it was coming from somewhere far away. She announced that today they would be playing a very special game, one that had never been played before. The game was simple, Madame Gazelle explained. Each child would take turns standing in the center of the circle while the others watched in complete silence. But as each friend took their turn, something horrible happened. They would stand up normally, but then their bodies would begin to change, stretching and twisting into impossible shapes. Peppa watched in horror as Susie Sheep's wool began to fall out in clumps, revealing gray, mottled skin underneath. Rebecca Rabbit's ears grew longer and longer until they dragged on the floor behind her. Pedro Pony's mane turned from brown to black and began to move like it was alive, writhing and reaching toward the other children. When it was finally Peppa's turn to stand in the center, she felt a strange tingling sensation spreading through her body. She looked down at her hands and saw that her pink skin was becoming translucent, and she could see dark veins pulsing underneath. Her red dress began to change color, shifting from bright red to deep crimson to black. The other children began to chant in unison, their voices creating a low, hypnotic hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls of the classroom. The words they spoke were in no language Peppa had ever heard, but somehow she understood their meaning. They were calling to something ancient and hungry, something that had been waiting for a very long time. As the chanting grew louder, the classroom began to change around them. The cheerful yellow walls darkened to a deep purple, and the windows became black as night. The toys and books that lined the shelves began to move on their own, rearranging themselves into strange patterns and symbols. Peppa tried to run toward the door, but her legs wouldn't obey her commands. She was trapped in the center of the circle, unable to move as the transformation continued. Her reflection in the classroom mirror showed something that was no longer quite Peppa, but something else entirely, something with too many teeth and eyes that glowed with an otherworldly light. The episode ended with Peppa's family driving home in the same eerie silence. But now Peppa sat in the back seat with the same black eyes and mechanical movements as the rest of her family. The car passed by other houses where other families were returning from their own strange days. All of them changed, all of them part of something larger and more terrifying than anyone could imagine. As they pulled into their driveway, Peppa looked up at her bedroom window and saw another version of herself looking back down, the version that had never left the house, the version that was still normal. But as she watched, that other Peppa slowly raised her hand and waved goodbye, before the curtains closed forever. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was Tuesday morning when Peppa and George woke up. Everything seemed normal until Peppa noticed the family photos on the wall were turned backwards, showing only blank frames. At breakfast, Daddy Pig read a newspaper with completely blank pages. George made his dinosaur noise, but no sound came out. Mummy Pig stirred an empty pan with a silent wooden spoon. Peppa's voice sounded distant and hollow. Outside, all the flowers had turned gray, and the grass looked like ash. The swing set stood motionless while trees swayed unnaturally. They visited Grandpa Pig's farm, but all animals stood like statues. Chickens didn't cluck, cows didn't moo, and ducks floated without ripples. Grandpa Pig's smile stretched unnaturally wide from ear to ear. Their footsteps made no sound on the gravel. George splashed in a muddy puddle, but the mud absorbed his feet like quicksand. Something moved underneath before his feet emerged completely clean. At their picnic, the food was wrong colors. Blue sandwiches, purple apples, black juice. Daddy Pig chewed thoughtfully, but his mouth was empty. They were pretending to eat food that wasn't there. The sun never moved in the sky, frozen in time. When Peppa looked at her family, their eyes had become completely black holes. They smiled and talked, but their voices sounded underwater. George's toy dinosaur walked by itself across the blanket. Other toys appeared, moving independently. Teddy bears walked upright, toy cars drove in circles, and dolls stared at Peppa with glassy, unblinking eyes. Walking home, the road stretched endlessly. The same landscape repeated, identical trees, fence posts, and mailboxes appearing over and over like a broken record. Their house looked different. Dark windows and a creaking door that made no sound. The house number had changed to shifting symbols that moved when she wasn't looking. Inside, everything was covered in dust as if abandoned for years. The television showed static that formed faces. The clock stopped at 12, all hands pointing up, frozen. In the bathroom mirror, Peppa's reflection brushed its teeth normally but watched her with intelligent eyes that reflections shouldn't have. In bed, complete silence surrounded them. George stared at the ceiling with open, unblinking eyes. He didn't respond when Peppa whispered his name. As she fell asleep, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Slow and deliberate, but they were her own footsteps even though she lay perfectly still. The pacing continued all night. Morning returned everything to normal, but Peppa knew that somewhere, in another version of their house, her family remained trapped in that silent gray world, while something else watched from behind their eyes. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary morning in Peppa's house, or so it seemed. Peppa woke up in her bedroom, but something felt different. The sunlight streaming through her window had an unusual pale quality, and the familiar sounds of her family were strangely absent. She called out for Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig, but only silence answered her. Peppa made her way downstairs to the kitchen, where she expected to find her family having breakfast. Instead, she found the table set for 4, with steaming bowls of porridge that seemed to have been waiting for hours. The porridge was still warm, but there was no one around. The chairs were pulled out as if someone had just left, but the house felt completely empty. George appeared in the doorway, but he looked different. His usual cheerful expression was replaced by a blank stare, and when he spoke, his voice sounded hollow and distant. He told Peppa that Mummy and Daddy had gone to a special place, and that they would be joining them soon. When Peppa asked where this special place was, George simply smiled a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The telephone rang, breaking the eerie silence. Peppa answered it, hoping to hear a familiar voice, but instead heard only static mixed with what sounded like whispers. The whispers seemed to be calling her name, but they came from voices she didn't recognize. The phone line crackled, and through the static, she could make out words about a gathering, about everyone coming together, about no one being left behind. Peppa decided to visit her friends to see if they knew what was happening. She walked to Susie Sheep's house, but when she knocked on the door, it creaked open by itself. Inside, she found Susie sitting in her living room, staring at a television that showed only static. Susie turned to look at Peppa, and her eyes seemed to reflect the static from the screen. She spoke in a monotone voice, telling Peppa that the program was about to begin and that everyone needed to watch. At Rebecca Rabbit's house, the same scene repeated. Rebecca sat motionless in front of a static-filled television, her usual energetic personality completely gone. She told Peppa that the special broadcast would explain everything, that soon everyone would understand their purpose. The static on the screen seemed to pulse with a rhythm that made Peppa feel dizzy and confused. Pedro Pony's house was no different. Pedro sat in his chair, eyes fixed on the flickering screen, speaking in the same hollow tone about the importance of watching, of listening, of becoming part of something bigger. Each friend Peppa visited had the same vacant expression, the same obsession with the mysterious broadcast that seemed to be coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. As evening approached, Peppa found herself back at home, where George was still waiting with that unsettling smile. He led her to the living room, where their television was now showing the same static as all the others. George told her that Mummy and Daddy were already part of the broadcast, that they were waiting inside the screen for Peppa and George to join them. The static began to clear, and Peppa could see shadowy figures moving within the screen. They looked familiar, but their movements were wrong, too slow and deliberate. George reached for Peppa's hand and told her it was time to step through, time to become part of the program that would never end. The figures in the screen turned toward them, and Peppa realized with growing horror that they had the faces of everyone she knew. But their eyes were empty, reflecting only the endless static. The screen began to glow brighter, and Peppa felt herself being pulled toward it. George's grip on her hand tightened, and his smile grew wider, revealing teeth that seemed sharper than they should be. The voices from the television grew louder, calling her name, promising that she would never be alone again, that she would always be part of the show. As the light from the screen enveloped her, Peppa's last thought was that the program was just beginning, and it would never, ever end. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary evening when Peppa and George were getting ready for bed. Mummy Pig had just finished reading them their favorite bedtime story, and Daddy Pig was downstairs watching television. The house felt warm and cozy, with the familiar yellow walls glowing softly in the lamplight. Everything seemed normal, just like any other night in the Pig family home. But as soon as the lights went out, something changed. Peppa noticed that her bedroom felt different somehow. The shadows on the walls seemed to move and shift, even though there was no wind. George's breathing sounded strange from his bed across the room, almost like he was whispering something in his sleep. When Peppa tried to listen more carefully, she realized the whispers weren't coming from George at all. The whispers were coming from inside the walls themselves. They started as a soft murmur, barely audible, but gradually grew louder and more distinct. The voices seemed to be calling her name over and over again, in a sing-song melody that made her skin crawl. Peppa pulled her blanket over her head, but the voices only grew stronger, seeping through the fabric like cold air. Suddenly, George sat up in his bed. But when he turned to look at Peppa, his eyes were completely black, like two empty holes in his face. His usual cheerful smile had been replaced by something much wider and more unsettling. When he spoke, his voice sounded wrong, deeper and echoing as if it was coming from somewhere far away. He told Peppa that the house wanted to play a special game with them tonight. The bedroom door creaked open by itself, revealing the dark hallway beyond. The familiar family photos on the walls had changed. In each picture, the faces of Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig were twisted into expressions of terror, their eyes following Peppa as she moved. The floorboards groaned under invisible footsteps, and the temperature in the house began to drop rapidly. George stood up and walked toward the door with jerky, unnatural movements, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. He beckoned for Peppa to follow him downstairs. As they descended the staircase, each step echoed through the house with a hollow, metallic sound. The living room below was bathed in an eerie blue light that seemed to come from nowhere. Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig were sitting on the sofa, but they weren't moving. They sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead with those same black, empty eyes. When Peppa called out to them, they turned their heads in perfect unison, their necks making a horrible cracking sound. Their smiles were too wide, stretching far beyond what should have been possible. The television was on, but instead of showing Daddy Pig's usual programs, it displayed images of the house itself, as if cameras were hidden in every room. Peppa could see herself and George on the screen, standing in the living room, but there were other figures in the background that weren't really there. Dark shapes that moved just at the edge of vision. The house began to change around them. The walls started to breathe, expanding and contracting like lungs. The furniture rearranged itself when no one was looking, and the windows showed not the familiar garden outside, but an endless black void. The family photos continued to change, showing scenes that had never happened, moments of fear and confusion that felt more real than memory. As the night wore on, Peppa realized that this wasn't just a bad dream. The house had become something else entirely, something that fed on the warmth and happiness of the family that lived within it. And now, it wanted to keep them forever, trapped in this twisted version of their home where nothing was quite as it should be, and morning would never come again. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. The school bell rang as usual that Tuesday morning, but something felt different when Peppa arrived at the playgroup. The building looked exactly the same from the outside, with its bright yellow walls and cheerful red roof. But there was an unusual silence hanging in the air. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. Peppa walked through the familiar blue doors and into the classroom where Madame Gazelle usually greeted everyone with her warm smile. But today, Madame Gazelle was standing perfectly still at the front of the class, facing the blackboard. Her back was turned to the children, and she hadn't moved or spoken since Peppa entered. One by one, Peppa's friends began to arrive. Susie Sheep bounced in as energetic as ever, followed by Pedro Pony, Rebecca Rabbit, and all the others. But as each child took their seat, they too became perfectly still and quiet. They sat with their hands folded neatly on their desks, staring straight ahead with expressions that seemed somehow empty. Peppa tried to talk to Susie, her best friend, but Susie didn't respond. She just continued staring forward with a blank smile that never changed. When Peppa waved her hand in front of Susie's face, there was no reaction at all. It was as if Susie couldn't see or hear her anymore. The classroom felt colder than usual, and Peppa noticed that the colorful drawings that normally decorated the walls had changed. The happy pictures of families and sunny days had been replaced by strange, dark sketches that seemed to move slightly when she wasn't looking directly at them. The alphabet letters above the blackboard appeared to be rearranging themselves into words she couldn't quite read. Madame Gazelle finally turned around, but her usual kind expression had been replaced by something mechanical and distant. Her eyes seemed to look right through Peppa as if she wasn't there at all. When she spoke, her voice sounded like it was coming from very far away, echoing strangely in the small classroom. She began the day's lesson, but instead of teaching about numbers or letters, she started talking about a special game that all the children would play. It was a game about staying perfectly still and quiet forever, about never moving or speaking again. The other children nodded in unison, their movements synchronized like clockwork dolls. Peppa felt a chill run down her spine as she realized she was the only one who seemed to remember how things used to be. She tried to stand up and leave, but found that her chair seemed to be holding her in place. The more she struggled, the heavier her body felt, as if invisible weights were being attached to her arms and legs. The windows of the classroom began to darken, even though it was still morning outside. The cheerful yellow walls started to fade to a sickly gray color, and the temperature continued to drop. Peppa could see her breath forming small clouds in the increasingly cold air. Madame Gazelle continued her lesson about the special game, explaining that once you learned to play it properly, you would never want to play anything else ever again. She said it was the most important lesson any child could learn, and that soon Peppa would understand why all her friends had chosen to play it. The other children began to turn their heads toward Peppa in perfect unison, their movements slow and deliberate. Their faces still wore those same empty smiles, but their eyes had become completely white, with no pupils or color remaining. They all spoke at the same time, their voices blending into one eerie chorus, inviting Peppa to join their special game. Peppa tried to call out for help, but her voice seemed to be getting weaker and weaker. The classroom felt like it was getting bigger and bigger, with the walls stretching away from her until her friends looked like tiny figures in the distance. Yet somehow, their white eyes remained clearly visible, always watching her. The clock on the wall had stopped ticking, its hands frozen at exactly 12 o'clock. But Peppa couldn't tell if it was noon or midnight anymore, because the darkness outside the windows had become complete. There were no streetlights, no cars, no signs of life anywhere beyond the classroom walls. Madame Gazelle approached Peppa's desk with that same mechanical smile, carrying a piece of chalk that seemed to glow with an unnatural light. She began writing something on Peppa's desk, symbols and letters that hurt to look at directly. As she wrote, Peppa felt her own thoughts becoming quieter and more distant. The special game was beginning to make sense now. It was about letting go of everything that made you who you were, about becoming part of something larger and more peaceful. Peppa's friends had already learned this lesson, and now they were waiting patiently for her to join them in their eternal stillness. As the chalk finished writing on her desk, Peppa felt her body beginning to relax. The struggle to move and speak was becoming less important. The cold air felt comfortable now, and the silence seemed welcoming rather than frightening. Her friend's white eyes no longer looked scary, but rather like beacons guiding her toward understanding. In the final moments before the lesson was complete, Peppa realized that this wasn't really a classroom anymore, and these weren't really her friends. But somehow that didn't matter. What mattered was that soon she would be just like them, perfectly still and perfectly quiet, playing the special game that never ends. The last thing Peppa remembered was the sound of chalk writing her name on the blackboard, adding it to a long list of other names that had been written there before. And then, like all the others, she learned to sit perfectly still and smile that same empty smile, waiting for the next child to arrive and learn about the special game that everyone must eventually play. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a quiet evening at the Pig family house when Peppa and George discovered something strange in their bedroom. The toys they had left scattered on the floor were now arranged in a perfect circle, all facing the center where their favorite teddy bear sat motionless. Peppa thought it was odd, but George just giggled and ran to play with his dinosaur. That night, as the family slept peacefully, the toys began to move on their own. The teddy bear's button eyes started glowing with an eerie red light, and it slowly turned its head toward the sleeping children. One by one, the other toys joined in, creating a silent parade around the room. The toy car rolled without being pushed, and the wooden blocks spelled out words that no child should ever read. When morning came, Peppa woke up to find all her toys staring directly at her bed. Their usual cheerful expressions had changed into something much more sinister. The teddy bear's smile had become a twisted grin, showing tiny sharp teeth that definitely weren't there before. George's dinosaur toy had grown real claws, and its plastic eyes had turned completely black. Peppa tried to tell Mummy and Daddy Pig about the strange behavior of their toys, but every time she spoke, the toys would return to their normal positions. Her parents thought she was just having bad dreams. But Peppa knew something was terribly wrong when she noticed that the toys were following her with their eyes wherever she went in the house. During breakfast, the family sat around their usual table in the bright yellow kitchen. Everything seemed normal until Peppa looked down at her plate and saw that her food had arranged itself into the same circle pattern as the toys. George started crying when his juice box began pouring itself, creating strange symbols on the table. The house began to change around them. The cheerful yellow walls started to fade to a sickly green color, and the windows showed not the sunny garden outside, but a dark forest filled with twisted trees and glowing eyes. The family portraits on the walls began to move, showing the pig family with increasingly frightened expressions. As the day progressed, more toys from around the house joined the strange gathering. Old dolls with cracked faces and stuffed animals with patches of fur missing all assembled in the growing circle. The toys began to whisper among themselves in voices too quiet for human ears, but Peppa could somehow understand every word. That evening, the toys made their final move. They surrounded the entire family in the living room, their eyes glowing brighter than ever before. The teddy bear stepped forward and spoke in a voice that sounded like rustling leaves. explaining that they needed the family's help to return to the world of the living. But just as the situation seemed hopeless, Peppa remembered something her grandmother had told her about the power of love and imagination. She closed her eyes tightly and began to think of all the happy times she had shared with her toys, all the adventures they had been on together. Slowly, the toys began to remember too. Their angry expressions softened as they recalled the gentle hands that had played with them and the comfort they had provided during scary nights. The red glow in their eyes faded, replaced by the warm light of cherished memories, and everything returned to normal.